Attention, attention please. Stand by for another episode of
When Humanists Attack.
Welcome to another episode of When Humanists Attack. I am your host today, Vincent Downing, and I have the very distinct honor and pleasure of introducing and interviewing our very own resident Jewish Taoist Pagan, Roger Kimmel Smith, who was one of the masterminds or ringleaders of a Temple of the Apotheosis, which was, as you may or may not know, the precursor to When Humanists Attack. As a friend of mine said to me the other day when I was explaining this project to them, he said, "Oh, so you're picking up from where you left off back in the late 90s. And I said, yes, well, yes, and hopefully have learned a thing or two. Welcome to the show, Roger. It's good to be talking to you again.
A pleasure to be with you, Vincent. I am thrilled, I should say, that you and Chris and Robin have reunited for this project, and very excited to see what we're going to make of it.
I'm really excited that the old team is back together again, too. We did get an awful lot accomplished back in the 90s before we called it a day. And as people with a track record who've hopefully learned a thing or two in the intervening years, I'm really hoping we can get a lot more done now, entering into the culture wars, making our voice a part of the current conversation, and advocating for humanism, which to us includes scientific literacy, communication skills, critical thinking, and things of that nature, skills that basically our entire species needs to master in order to move from a series of competing tribes to a global civilization. And that's quite a bit for us to be taking on. I realize
right,
that.
Especially at a time when the human species is in danger of a quick demise. Oh,
quick! What an optimist you still are, Roger. I'm glad. I'm glad we can still
it makes
say
me, if
that.
I can just begin by turning the tables quickly. I wonder. The question that's forming in my own mind is whether you share my sense that whatever we're going to make of humanism now consists not only of the really important but very cerebral and very global set of qualities you mentioned, but also has, underneath it as perhaps its yin, a much more local and pragmatic manifestation.
Absolutely. Which very well said, Roger. That's part of what I tend to leave out of my discussion. I'm involved in a great deal of volunteer work, for example, as a board member of the Brooklyn Society of Ethical Culture, which is a humanist organization here in Brooklyn. We do a lot of educational programs. We do services for other groups in the area, mostly by providing, well, this was of course pre-pandemic, but we were providing a lot of organizations with low or no cost places to meet, given the cost of meeting space in New York City. That was actually a lot more of a service than I was thinking at the time.
Oh, yeah. Physical, logistical infrastructure for community organizations, right? You said at the top, we accomplished a lot. And, I tend not to think of it that way, which may just be my natural modesty. I think in terms of community building functions, which were always essential, are what I'm hearing you describe the Ethical Culture Society as providing. If the COVID-19 pandemic is providing us a little window onto ways that civilization is disintegrating or decaying. One thing it's doing, I think, is taking us collectively down the hierarchy of needs. You have to think about root survival and the skill sets that actually help contribute on a local level.
Who is essential and who is not? For example, the delivery people who are paid pittance being essential to get us our food here in New York City, you working at the food co-op. I was
going to say it, I was doing this writing editing work for a decade. My income started diminishing dangerously in 2019. And I thought to look for a part-time job. Fortunately, it was easy for me to find one at the food co-op because I had been working there 2 hours a week for the whole decade through their super worker program in exchange just for a discount on groceries. They swiftly hired me and I started doing 3 8-hour shifts a week. Then a few months into that, all of a sudden, the governor of the state was saying, I counted among those doing essential work. And, we can debate and reflect on the meaning and the shades of meaning in the term. On one level, it was definitely kind of bracing and sort of welcome for me to think, all right, finally, for a decade, I've been playing around with words. Before that, I tried a teaching career. Before that, worked in nonprofit sector. I worked at the UN. I did gadfly political organizing. Finally, I'm doing something essential, is my point. Right? But I do appreciate it. We are getting lessons. And as one of my favorite lines from Citizen Kane is the boss says, you're going to need more than one lesson and you're going to get more than one lesson. And we're all going to get more than one lesson in what it will take for us to survive this century.
So that's what you've been up to since 1998, which is when we called it a year or a day for a Temple of the Apotheosis.
You were very serious in your worship of Baozedo.
Yes, the great god of the cosmic joke, great goddess of the cosmic joke. Actually, I would like to clarify that I am still a practitioner of and communicant at the mysteries of Baozedo. I never stopped doing that, and I dare say you probably never did either, although we haven't discussed it until now.
We're used to thinking that this thinking work, this cerebral work, it reminds me of Jewish men and their yeshiva and how much they value the exalted work of engaging with the divine. The flaw in that setup is that the women's work, the pragmatic work of feeding the humans, raising the young humans, and keeping the community together and functioning and alive has to be denigrated, considered less important because it's lower down on the hierarchy of needs, or lower on the Kabbalistic one. It's lower chakra work.
Yeah.
We did not succumb so much, I think, to that particular flaw. This was community building. What we were doing, it had both the upper and the lower, so to speak, kinds of function. I just had an idea for another person I could conceivably interview for this program, an old friend of mine who is now a philosopher and comedy writer. His philosophical book is entitled "Does Santa Exist?" He essentially leans on humor as either the antidote to or corollary of the Western philosophical tradition. Certainly by this point in this century, it's quite clear that from a religious standpoint, the unchurched, the I'm not any religion, or not any, I'm the none of the above,
the nuns,
whatever you want to call it, have achieved a plurality in U.S. society, as far as I can tell. There's a lot of us, so that's a large constituency. That's only one way of framing the question. You can stage it another way to draw or attract or provide content, provide roadmaps, and provide a way for those people to take themselves just seriously enough. One of the root concepts for my Jewish Taoist paganism would be the one is part of the many, which is the one. This is, essentially a spiritual concept, one that is spoken for in the Eastern and much better than, or as opposed to the Western religions, but really isn't so much a religious concept as a philosophical one. So we can all embrace it.
That actually might be one of our ongoing difficulties or ongoing projects, as I see it now, for when humanists attack, is fostering the conversation where all of us nuns or none of the aboves or no affiliation religiously or whatever you want to call us, how do we get us organized so that we're not at the mercy of people who, honest to goodness, I see as willing to impose their delusions and their lack of critical thinking on the rest of us by law.
Yeah. I'm not sure I would use organized as a word to give people in that large basket to the types of conversations you're talking about on the great issues, not of just of our time, but of all time. Because one thing you can say in favor of religions is that they're not shy about weighing in on those questions and giving us all sorts of dogma and ways of thinking. It's not so much organizing as giving people a way in a sense that they can belly up to the bar of these great questions of life, the way religions make people think they can dare address those questions. The religions usually provide religious answers and dogma to these questions with which we can contend. But my point is they engage with the questions, and I wonder whether many of the none of the aboves tend to just live lives that duck ultimate questions. But you can't duck them ultimately because we live and we die. And so death is a matter of import, and there are others. So there is some internal consistency to a point of view that doesn't often get named and that you are bravely calling humanism.
Well, I would only take issue with the idea that all we need to do or should be doing or hope to do is to get people involved in a conversation. I really do think that we need to be organized, because the people who are quite happy to drive our entire species, if not our whole ecosystem, right over a cliff into some kind of very costly oblivion, are organized.
Oh, absolutely.
So I don't see that we've got the option, if we want to survive, of being unorganized.
The question is, what is the basis for the organizing?
I think we're coming from a position where we were trying to get a bunch of nuns organized enough to get some stuff accomplished.
I don't think that the none of the aboves are organizable on a spiritual or religious plane. The organizing that we need, that you're speaking of, is and probably must inevitably be plainly political. In the USA, we have our whole church and state debate. We have a long-standing ambivalence and ambiguity about the relationship between religious and political questions, and between religious and political organizing. But I agree with you that time is running out, or has virtually run out.
There really is this sense, I certainly have a sense, that the word apocalyptic is not at all misplaced. That we're really, the apocalypse, woo-hoo-hoo-hoo. But
yeah, we have great, news media to bring in, the stories and the footage
and make it worse.
And whatever, they had 10 plagues in the Jewish Passover. How many have we got? Reverend Billy, I'm sure, does this kind of shtick.
Maybe where we are winding down, I get that sense.
Civilization is, you mean?
Well, yes, our civilization is getting ready to probably to crash down. I mean, I was hoping for a much more peaceful transition, but with all of this science denial that's going on, all this reality denial, all of this
Responsibility
dogmatic
denial.
thinking. And let me just be clear. I see the dogmatic thinking on both the left and the right.
Mhm.
You know, all of the and all of these people, good people, okay, good people who are terrified because of all this change happening at an unthinkable rate in unthinkable ways.
Change
And what
makes
they're
you think
doing
of
is
what you might want to conserve,
they're making up.
what currently exists.
Well, I don't. Yep, that's a good point. But I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff that I'd really like to conserve. You know, think
Yeah.
of New York City. New York City isn't going to do me much goddamn good under 52 feet of water or whatever it is it winds up being under.
We lost those big two towers, but I remember, being up on the roof of our Park Slope apartments, looking out at those two towers and the rest of the skyline before they fell back during our days in the mid 90s, thinking this shit is not always going to be here. This is a weird landscape as it currently exists. I'd like to keep the Brooklyn Bridge. I would like us to still be aware that there were cool recordings made in the 1920s and 30s, 200 years from now.
Yeah, absolutely. I would like as much of as possible to be conserved and brought forward, and I'd like a minimal loss of life. This is my
I've
problem.
given that one up.
I still haven't given that one up. I mean,
our population got way too high. It's there's gonna be maximal loss of life. But I think that one of the threads to which I cling is that it's the indigenous societies of the world that stand the greatest chance of survival because they have always been oriented towards survival and rarely bought into the illusion that anything else is really possible in life from generation to generation. So they have the right orientation.
I mean, that is one of the good things about getting older, is that you've got this perspective, particularly on yourself, particularly if you've actually been paying attention to yourself,
we're just older.
No, because my friend, I know people who are just older and they've been thinking the same thoughts since they've been teenagers, and pretty much the only goddamn thing they've picked up is a tendency to rot. And that really,
I've been thinking of these same questions.
That really does
many
make
decades now. Well, I don't know, but they sure are good questions.
Or you've not been thinking of them because somebody gave you your answer when you were 12, and you've stuck with it all this time. And you've basically just got that.
The stakes are higher culturally. The stakes are far higher environmentally. There's no denying that. Anybody who attempts to deny that, what they're really denying is responsibility.
Yes.
For it.
Yes. That's what I say.
Responsibility for having caused the problem, responsibility for contending with our situation. That is sobering.
There really is this sense, I certainly have a sense, that the word apocalyptic is not at all misplaced. That we're really, the apocalypse, woo-hoo-hoo-hoo. But
we have great, news media to bring in, the stories and the footage
and make it worse.
And whatever, they had 10 plagues in the Jewish Passover. How many have we got? Reverend Billy, I'm sure, does this kind of shtick.
Maybe where we are winding down. I get that sense.
Civilization is, you mean?
Well, yes, our civilization is getting ready to probably to crash down. I mean, I was hoping for a much more peaceful transition, but with all of this science denial that's going on, all this reality denial, all of this
Responsibility
dogmatic
denial.
thinking. And let me just be clear. I see the dogmatic thinking on both the left and the right.
Mhm.
You know, all of the and all of these people, good people, okay, good people who are terrified because of all this change happening at an unthinkable rate in unthinkable ways.
Change
And what
makes
they're
you think
doing
of
is
what you might want to conserve,
they're making
what
up.
currently exists.
Well, I don't. Yep, that's a good point. But where I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff that I'd really like to conserve. You know, think
Yeah.
of New York City. New York City isn't going to do me much goddamn good under 52 feet of water or whatever it is it winds up being under.
We lost those big two towers, but I remember being up on the roof of our Park Slope apartments, looking out at those two towers and the rest of the skyline before they fell back
Yeah.
during
Yeah.
our days in the mid 90s, thinking this shit is not always going to be here. This is a weird landscape as it currently exists. I'd like to keep the Brooklyn Bridge. I would like us to still be aware that there were cool recordings made in the 1920s and 30s,
Yeah.
200 years from now.
Yeah. Absolutely. I would like as much of as possible to be conserved and brought forward, and I'd like a minimal loss of life. This is my
I've
problem.
given that one up.
I still haven't given that one up. I mean,
our population got way too high. There's gonna be maximal loss of life. But I think that one of the threads to which I cling is that it's the indigenous societies of the world that stand the greatest chance of survival because they have always been oriented towards survival and rarely bought into the illusion that anything else is really possible in life from generation to generation. So they have the right orientation.
I buy into the illusion that there's more than survival is possible because I'm going to cling to the myth of progress.
The year before I met all of you, I had been on this walk across America, ending in the Western Shoshone land at the nuclear test site in Nevada on Columbus Day of 1992, the quincentennial year. So I had this orientation from that experience and the prayer circles and actually meeting Native American folks and being on lands where they were still practicing. One thing I learned that year was the concept of progressivism among Native Americans is generally put in the same basket as all of the rest of the failed Western isms. Much of the political debate about ways forward for Native American groups consists of debates between progressive ideas about how the societies, nations should develop, and traditionalist views may map onto a more conservative style of thinking, but in the Native American context, relate to a tradition that goes back to the beginning of humans, the one that's survival oriented. The folks I met tended to think that at the very least, those two camps needed to listen to each other very respectfully, and at the most, it was the traditionalists who had the right ideas. So I just placed that before you say more about the myth of progress, which I hope you will.
I've got plenty of people who dismiss progress and progressivism, be it a myth or a reality. So I would have to say that I respectfully disagree with the good people of the
Western Shoshone.
I could not disagree more. That's
what constitutes progress, and as a sub-question, who defines it, are live questions in any cultural debate.
Progress constitutes the cultural memeplexes that allow you to do more from one time period to another, the extension of capacities. So that's one kind of progress. Another kind of progress.
That's how Marshall McLuhan saw media, as I'm sure you're aware.
I know, but that's fine. Marshall and I are, I read some of his stuff way back, and good, great. And the other kind of progress that I recognize is the kind of progress that makes more of the assets or the resources that allow more people to move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs in any
Right.
given
It's
society.
it's
That's
it's
that's
not
another
it's
kind
not a
of progress.
material or materialist kind of more. It's not accumulation.
If nobody has any bloody damned food to eat, then they're not going to be worried about what comes next. So in part, of course, what I'm talking about are material possessions. I like things like eyeglasses so that I can see better. I like this technology that we've got. What you don't want to do is lose sight of the whole picture, of the whole the whole progression up the mountain, Maslow's mountain, as I've heard it called. From you just don't want to get caught in the idea that the number of zeros on my bank account is the be all and end all. If you've lost
Right.
sight
Or
of something. That's progress to some people. That's all they understand is the number of zeros in their bank account. And I don't know what to say to that person, except that I want a social contract that allows for that and more than that.
maybe they don't really get the hierarchy of needs or understand it or subscribe to it as a governing meme.
They might not.
It sounds like a very misplaced interpretation of them.
I would humbly think that they are just misinterpreting. I consider gay marriage over non-gay marriage. That's progress as far as I'm concerned. Now you talk to a fundamentalist Christian, they would say, well, that's not progress. Well, we're not always going to get consensus over what progress is. I consider the empowerment of women to be progress of a kind that incidentally will solve the population problem. So different kinds of progress.
I guess these are social questions that have often been debated in terms of the nation and its national aspirations. Dr. King's dream, the notion of a more perfect union implies a great faith in a certain kind of progress that sounds very much like what you're defending. Perhaps it is only now, only in 2020, and this is, I think, underlying the message of the George Floyd protests. Only now do we get to speak forthrightly about what was buried, what was suffering, what was left out of all of these articulations of the American National Project. The genocide and the slavery. Just impossible, really, for a society to deal with that straightforwardly while aiming for the moon and for the very complex kinds of social progress that we've tended either to believe in or to dream of.
You can't make the kind of progress that I would like to see happen unless you, as your whole society, are willing to bite the bullet or the leather strap in your mouth and submit to the necessary procedures that allow you, the operation, the surgery, the whatever you want to call it, the painful what's this that you need to go through in order to make these changes, to face the stuff. One of the upcoming shows that we're planning to do is entitled, Why Did It Take So Long for Black Lives to Matter? And why do we have so many people who are still unwilling to face this issue, this situation,
this second very valid question.
What the hell? Why did certain conservatives that I know go from right after the George Floyd tape was released to saying, yeah, that was really what those cops did was really, that's just not right. To, yeah, well, that George Floyd, he was, he did this and blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, these people are you're defending this? You're defending this? This man was tortured to death for 9 minutes by a police officer while these other police officers stood around and watched while they got their jollies watching a fellow human being be tortured to death. This is monstrous, okay? This isn't just a few bad apples. This is a barrel full of rot. And there are people who just simply refuse to acknowledge this. They just refuse to acknowledge this. But then again, you deal with individual human beings, and we refuse to acknowledge our glaring shortcomings and our insanities and our, the stuff that has been wrong with us from the start that maybe you can't even fix. But if you can't fix something, for the love of blah, at least acknowledge it so you can compensate for it somehow. Do something intelligent to compensate for it.
It's a necessary early step. But, we've had great cognitive dissonance about these questions. Those who haven't been on the receiving end of the punishment.
The only reason I know anything about it is I was a queer kid growing up in fear of my life among the Catholics. And that's how I understood richly, deeply, viscerally, experientially, existentially, hormonally, intellectually, and emotionally that this country has always been a police state for some of its citizens, and the police and the other authorities could do whatever they wanted to you and be confident of getting away with it, whatever they fucking felt like. And the only reason I have any knowledge of that is because I grew up as the designated monster among the Catholics. And the reason I'm alive today is because I had protective coloration. So I guess what is that bringing me to? What that brings me to is I can't even imagine the courage it must take to be a Black person walking around in this culture with all of these lunatic crazies and all of these good cops walking around who feel entitled to brutalize and occasionally torture somebody to death if they're feeling cranky that day in front of witnesses with the full knowledge that they can get away with this and would be still getting away with this if we didn't have all these cameras in our phones. That's the thing that amazes me. It would still be going on, and all these people would be in complete and utter denial of the situation if not for these cameras in their phones. And how many of the police were inciting riots and worse during these demonstrations by routinely attacking peaceful demonstrators, people who were standing around doing nothing other than exercising their First Amendment rights, and the cops would just attack them.
I read an essay that started by saying what we're facing is a superabundance of the unresolved past. It's all sort of vomiting itself up in front of us, cannot be dismissed. It's going to have to be dealt with. We have a pretty urgent task for the next 100 days, and not so much two parties, but 4 political factions, or a fifth. I wrote about this recently. We know about the divide in the Democratic Party is essentially the one that's been true ever since Henry Wallace in 1948, which is essentially the voters versus donors problem the Democrats have always had and still have. we now have factionalism, although it's much harder to see on the other side between the red and orange teams. Both of those factions consist of people of conservative philosophies, so they orient much more towards uniformity, hierarchy. They don't want to display that there's growing daylight between them. A friend of mine said, well, just think about the question of mask wearing. Those who are oriented towards that side, who are willing to put the thing on their face, are essentially defying the Orange Order by doing so. And it's a divide that it seems inevitable that it will grow in both size and in importance for us all as time goes on. We have to draw people from all of the factions to take a stand against this road to authoritarianism within 100 days. And then we'll deal with the next set of problems. And we'll do so in a better position because it will have started us back into a notion of having something in common besides armed camps.
I can't find a single thing to disagree with there. So I would say I would actually like to take this opportunity to discharge a 20+ year old debt to you that you have not known about all this time. And this is concerning a conversation that you, me, and Chris West, one of the other ringleaders. This was a conversation that we were having that was based on the interactions between us and a group of friends who were all involved together in the precursor to a temple of the apotheosis called the Focus Circle, which
an earlier Vincent Pilate.
There's a string of them all the way back to anyway.
The Wright brothers needed many of them too.
The one with the 3 wings that crumples into the ground. There's a lot of them out there like that. Thank goodness, no
10,000 failed filaments.
No footage exists. At any rate, you, Chris, and I, you actually convened this meeting, and you sat Chris and I down to give us let's call it a Roger Kimmel Smith talking with rather than talking to about the concerns of these friends of ours who were highly concerned about the capacity that I had to, and I quote, see through people and know about their shit, which Chris also had in a somewhat lesser degree, presumably because of some sort of sinister alliance, apprenticeship that he had with me, where he was learning these dark, nameless skills. And
you were during those years, bandying about words like magic and spelling them with a K.
I was really hoping that one would never come up again, but there we have it.
But again, I'm interrupting.
I'm sorry. Hello. I can't hear anything you're saying. So the talking with that you gave us about these skills that we had and the reactions that people were having to them was your usual very thoughtful and insightful and even ye gods and little fishes well-spoken again or articulate talking with. And out of that conversation, I immediately had a new faith in and confidence in my instincts to exercise this skill which as the years went by, expanded throughout my personality and enabled me to achieve a whole bunch of things that it would have taken a great deal longer for me to achieve. Now, I'm not saying that I wouldn't have done this on my own recognizance, but because of this conversation, I was able to get the ball rolling with your help on this, probably a good decade or more earlier than otherwise. Now, I have been thinking about this through all of these intervening years and pondering how to best thank you for doing such an immeasurably good deed, the magnitude of which you really just don't run into that often in your life. Archimedes' lever, somebody just kind of puts their fingertip on something and it changes the whole situation.
Screw
Now, whether
Archimedes' lever, we're talking about Zuzu's pedals.
Woohoo! Yeah. Whether or not you meant to do it, of course, is immaterial. I did get that measure of benefit from the thing. Now,
you're welcome.
As Chris and Robin will tell you, I had found this a plaster statue in the street near my house and was repairing it and painting it with gold. And I was getting ready to inscribe a thank you along the base. And I had this thing to put in the hand. It was a statue of a man to put in the hand. And I had this whole plan, this award, this thank you award. And then, of course, I got all of the constituent parts ready for this, knocked the statue over and smashed it into a million pieces. And then was sort of left at my wit's end. I've been searching online for another replacement statue since. Haven't found anything proper. And I just kind of decided to take the easy way out and thank you
and
on air and online.
Humanists attack.
For this.
I guess it's just as well.
They won't be able to smash this one into a million pieces before I finish gilding it with my very own mixture of bright and brilliant gold paint that I mix myself. So anyway, thank you very much, Roger. A real
You're welcome.
example
Next,
of the kind of thing that we hope to do for each other and would like to see more people doing in the world out there as humanists and just maybe as just good old human beings.
It is nice to hear that I could have had the idea for an intervention and that it would have done good.
It really
I very rarely got that sense of satisfaction from any interventions I initiated during my parenting.
Well, I might be a little bit more malleable than a 4-year-old. Okay. Well, anyway, I would like to thank all of you for giving us your valuable time and watching another episode of When Humanists Attack.